privilege and pleasure to introduce a fellow vice chair, Dr. Kaveh Shojania. Kaveh is professor and vice chair of quality and innovation in the Department of Medicine. He's known to many of you, but I'm going to go through an introduction just in case people just need a refresher on his remarkable accomplishments. So Kaveh is also a hospitalist, a very proud hospitalist at Sunnybrook. He does research in identifying and further developing effective strategies for achieving improved healthcare quality. Kaveh's academic career is notable for publishing over 150 papers in many different journals, including the New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA, and Lancet. He has an extremely high H-index of 67. Notably, also as well, he was editor-in-chief of BMJ Quality and Safety. This went from a fairly not little known journal, but low impact journal to one of impact factor of over 7, going from 2 to 7, and is now considered the second highest impact journal among 90 plus journals covering not only healthcare quality and safety, but all of healthcare services research, clinical informatics, health policy, and medical education. Kaveh attended the University of Manitoba, followed by a year at UBC, where he moved just after a year to the Brigham and Women's in Boston, finished there and did a fellowship at University of California, San Francisco, and stayed on faculty at UCSF until he was recruited back here. Kaveh has formerly held a Canada Research Chair in Patient Safety and Quality Improvement from 2004 to 2013. He has been in this clinicians and quality and innovation job for quite a while and has actually established it as an actual academic position description. Started out with 4 faculty members back in 2012. It has grown to well over 60 and is a major stream in terms of professional development and career within the department. In 2018, he received the Department of Medicine's Robert Hyland Award for Excellence in Mentorship. And this says a lot about how Kaveh mentors. And I think many people in the department are proud to call him their mentor. And he regards this as one of his most important qualifications. So at this point, I would like to go ahead and turn it over to Kaveh. So Kaveh, please.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Arno, for that kind introduction. And thank you in advance, everyone, for your attention. This is a talk I've been working on and giving versions of over the past few months, and it's still a work in progress. So I'll definitely welcome feedback on the ideas I'll be presenting, some of which I'm not sure yet what to do with myself. Before I say anything more, let me just state that I have no actual or potential conflicts to disclose. After what we've all been living through with COVID for about 12 months now, it's easy to forget the palpable anxiety about the climate crisis and the increasing frequency with which it was receiving attention in mainstream news and even major medical journals just before the lockdown hit. This attention was due in no small part to the wildfires raging in Australia in early 2020 and the subsequent similar climate-related fires in California, BC, Russia, and elsewhere. The wildfires in Australia killed dozens of people, displaced thousands more, and killed a staggering 1 billion animals. These fires could be seen from space, as could the fires in California. It was in that context that this essay by a gastroenterologist at Penn appeared in the New England Journal. The author recalled once reading an interview with novelist Jonathan Safran Foer saying that he had thought for a long time about becoming a doctor because it's a profession where one doesn't have to question its value. Who goes home after a day of delivering babies or saving lives and questions the point of this work? The writer mentions how often during his training and subsequent career he remembered this interview, grateful that a career in clinical medicine would never require an elevator pitch. And yet, he goes on to write, under the strange gravity of the Anthropocene era, clinical medicine has begun to feel a bit weightless. At the end of a long day, I will have performed 16 colonoscopies, but the ice caps will still be melting and another bag or 2 of medical waste will be ready to burn. It raises questions that I'm surprised most clinicians aren't asking of themselves or each other. With apocalyptic forecasts for the natural world being rendered with increasing urgency, it is hard not to question the value of what we do. What does it mean to engage with individual distress inside a hospital while bearing witness to cataclysmic distress outside it? 15 months after this articulation of a feeling of weightlessness in the setting of such cataclysmic distress, it's hard to even keep track of all the crises, not just the current COVID pandemic, but the near certainty of future such pandemics, the climate crisis and collapsing ecosystems, systemic racism, which is literally killing people in the streets, in addition to exacting insidious effects on so many aspects of health and healthcare for racialized groups, levels of economic inequalities approaching those last seen under feudalism, and the ongoing opiates crisis and related deaths of despair, which in parts of Canada and the US lowered average life expectancy even before COVID did so. Because of these multiple massive crises, many have pointed out the importance of not returning to pre-COVID normal, the need to break from ways of living and configuring society that have created these crises in the first place. Yet if we see the need for major changes in how we live and how we configure society, why have we talked so little about our research priorities? Surely they ought to change in the face of such massive crises. It is hard to imagine how the main types of basic and translational research we've been conducting, or our approaches to healthcare improvement, will deliver worthwhile benefits in the face of the scale of the adverse health impacts of these massive crises. Why has there been so little talk about changing research priorities? Probably because the mainstream view holds that biomedical research routinely produces important advances. We are just not very good at making sure they are translated into practice in a timely and consistent enough manner. This simple diagram also makes clear why in many contexts people refer to knowledge translation and implementation science instead of quality improvement, because the goal of QI is to translate into practice or implement the results of biomedical research that have been shown to be evidence-based. I showed the citation at the bottom to a large evidence report I led for the US government in the early 2000s to highlight that I shared this mainstream view for many years. But I've come to believe it faces two fundamental challenges. First, most improvement strategies don't work when rigorously evaluated, and the ones which do typically confer marginal improvements on narrow aspects of care. Even worse, though, is the second challenge, namely that most clinical interventions also turn out not to work or to confer small benefits, so are not that worth translating into practice anyway. This second claim is obviously more controversial, so I won't spend much time on backing up the first one, and we'll just show a few representative examples. The QI example I highlight is computerized decision support systems. Complaints about the institutional and individual pain of implementing commercial EHRs like Epic are well known, but one of the big payoffs is supposed to come in the form of computerized decision support systems. Once the EHR is up and running, it offers an efficient strategy for modifying clinician behavior and thus improving care. These decision support systems include simple alerts about allergies, reminders about preventive care, as well as more complex decision support, for instance, drug dose adjustments based on renal function. And they are also the presumed conduit for eventual AI innovations, alerting clinicians to diagnoses such as early sepsis or recommending treatment strategies. This is a sad looking slide because it's from a study I did over 20 years ago, my first piece of published research, in fact. I was doing my residency at the Brigham, which was one of the early pioneers in computerized order entry. And in the early days of VRE, working with my supervisor at the time, Dr. David Bates, now an international expert in informatics and patient safety more generally, we designed a pop-up alert whenever clinicians went to enter an order for vancomycin. The pop-up presented the CDC indications for using vanco and asked clinicians to choose one of the displayed reasons or acknowledge that they would not order it after all. We achieved a roughly 30% reduction in vancomycin use, and I can still remember elatedly jumping out of my chair when I saw the statistician's email with the crucial p equals 0.02. Fast forward roughly 20 years and working with Janice Kwan at Mount Sinai and others here in Toronto and Ottawa, we performed a meta-analysis of trials involving these sorts of pop-up alerts and computerized decision support systems in general. Past systematic reviews on this topic, including ones in high-impact journals, reported the percentage of studies with positive results or just analyzed predictors of those positive results. No one had quantified how much impact they actually deliver. To assess the actual improvements they produce, we captured all the data in terms of the percentage of patients receiving whatever the alert or decision support recommended. For interventions discouraging an order, like the vancomycin example, we reverse coded everything as the percentage of patients not receiving vancomycin or whatever was being discouraged. What this forest plot from the paper shows is that across 122 trials with over 1 million patients and over 10,000 clinicians, the interventions increased the percentage of patients receiving recommended care by just 5.8%. To appreciate why this result is so disappointing, a median of 39% of control patients across these trials already received what was being recommended by the decision support. The meta-analytic result means that the typical percentage in the intervention group was just 6% higher, or 45%, meaning that just over half of patients still did not receive recommended care. In a systematic review in the CMAJ just over 25 years ago, there were already 102 trials aimed at improving professional practice, and the authors concluded that we have no magic bullets. Most interventions produce small to modest effect. This remains true today. Common KT or QI interventions like computerized decision support, as I just showed, but also audit and feedback, or so-called performance report cards, and educational outreach, sometimes called academic detailing, typically improve the percentage of patients receiving recommended care by just 5%. And again, each of these results refers to the small absolute increase in patients receiving recommended care or not receiving inappropriate care. Those examples were focused on a single type of QI intervention across a variety of targets. This example highlights that we have the same problem of marginal gains from improvement efforts directed at single conditions, even common ones like diabetes. This meta-analysis came out in the Lancet about 10 years ago now. I was the senior author on it, but it led an earlier one in JAMA in the mid-2000s. Across 152 trials of 11 well-defined categories of improvement interventions, the pooled effect on glycemic control was a reduction in hemoglobin A1C of just 0.37%. As we all know, the target here is in the 6 to 7% range, but the typical value for someone needing better glycemic control is 8%, sometimes 9 to 10%. So 0.37% is a drop in the bucket. It will be noticeable only for the people already almost at the target. There have been more noteworthy successes in quality improvement, but they tend to involve very narrow targets, like this example. The intervention targeted high-risk prescriptions for antiplatelet agents and NSAIDs, and it consisted of educational outreach visits by pharmacists, weekly reports sent to each practice identifying their at-risk patients, and financial incentives for clinicians to review these cases to see if they could stop or modify the prescriptions. I want to make clear that this was an exemplary study. The intervention was thoughtfully developed and iteratively refined in prior work involving 4 pilot sites, and it was then rolled out across 33 general practices in Scotland in a step wedge design for the evaluation. The middle panel gives a sense of the robust 40% relative reduction in these high-risk prescriptions for NSAIDs and antiplatelet agents, and the third panel shows that the effect was sustained in the 18th month post-intervention period. But as highlighted in the text box, this worthwhile effect size relates to a target which applied to only 3.7% of patients. We can't possibly have multiple concurrent such projects with financial incentives and feedback reports and quality improvement efforts within each practice in response to these reports from multiple such narrow targets. So that's the brief overview of the basis for the first point, that most improvement interventions, when rigorously evaluated, turn out not to work or to achieve small gains, and those that produce larger improvements tend to involve narrow targets. Let's turn to the more controversial second point, namely that the same characterization applies to the rest of the biomedical research enterprise. I realize that the development of COVID vaccines in less than a year gives the impression that biomedical research routinely produces useful solutions to pressing health problems. Yet when one reflects on the typical results reported in major journals, most rigorous evaluations end up showing that potentially promising therapies don't work after all, or they have small effects, often not even on hard clinical outcomes. Here's one example to back up this qualitative impression that we see far more null results than we do positive ones. This study looked at large cardiovascular trials funded by the NHLBI at the NIH and compared the results before and after 2000, when clinical trial registration became common. Once it became harder to report a different primary outcome than had been specified a priori, positive trials fell from 57% to 8%. If you just look at trials published in the New England and JAMA, which is obviously a huge selection bias, the positivity rate is 25%. So despite massive improvements in cardiovascular research, most therapies, once rigorously evaluated, don't pan out, as with most medical research. Not only do most therapies not pan out, but the minority that do has small effects, even cornerstones of clinical care like statins. Among patients with established atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, 33 to 100 patients need to take a statin for 10 years in order to prevent one CVD death, MI, ischemic stroke, or recurrent ischemic event. This summary of the impact of statins comes from UpToDate, not some fringe article taking potshots at mainstream therapies. The second bullet point comes from an intriguing analytic approach which used trial data to model Kaplan-Meier survival curves in order to quantify a longevity effect in terms of the postponement of death. Analyzing trials with at least 1,000 patients and follow-up of at least 2 years, statins postpone death by 10 days in primary prevention trials and 17 days in secondary prevention. Imagine if instead of a vaccine for COVID, we spent billions of dollars a year on a medication that 33 to 100 patients needed to take for 10 years in order to prevent one COVID-related hospitalization or death. We are so used to seeing therapeutic effects reported in terms of odds ratios and relative risks, often for disease-specific endpoints, that we forget the rarity of medical interventions that materially improve the length and quality of people's lives. I could give other examples, but instead will make the general point that the primacy of randomized controlled trials in medicine itself reflects the small effects of most interventions. The need to ensure balanced distributions of known and unknown possible confounders and use various forms of blinding reflects the reality that all of the following have larger effects than most medical interventions: chance variation, psychological effects on patients, clinicians, and outcome assessors, and confounding socioeconomic factors. Some of you may remember this piece from the BMJ Christmas issue some 17 years ago now, a systematic review of parachute use to prevent trauma related to gravitational challenge. The joke here is supposed to be on rigid EBM advocates calling for RCTs for interventions with obvious benefits in observational studies. But the real joke is on the whole of biomedicine for producing so few parachutes that we keep needing RCTs to evaluate what we produce instead. So in a nutshell, that's the basis for these two fundamental challenges to the mainstream view of progress in biomedicine. Most efforts to translate evidence from research into practice produce marginal gains, and it turns out most of the evidence we're trying to translate has such small impacts on meaningful patient outcomes that it's not clear how worth it is to get better at this approach to quality improvement. There are many more examples I could give, but rather than taking the time to go through them, I'll address the point some of you may have in mind, namely that if things were really this bad, surely we would have noticed some alarming concrete signals. In fact, we have such alarming signals. Here is a particularly arresting one: the London tube map, but with the stations showing the average life expectancy for the surrounding neighborhood. As you'll see, for instance, along the red line in the middle, there are stations with very long lifespans, 90 and 96 years. And then the next station drops to 85 and then 79 years. It's hard to think of biomedical interventions with this sort of impact other than public health and living standards, the things we have watched be eroded over the past 100 years while we pursued an agenda dominated by precision medicine. This study from September came out in the PNAS, proudly concluding that if we analyze detectable alterations in proteomic, metabolomic, and standard laboratory measurements, we can identify patients at risk for various diseases. As one commentator wrote, this might be regarded as the first step on the road to personalized medicine. Yet we can already assess an individual's risk for something far more important than any specific disease, namely living a much shorter life. Why are we so convinced that precision medicine offers the main solution to health problems when we can already predict huge differences in life expectancy on the basis of postal code? These stark differences do not reflect variations in access to or quality of healthcare, nor will they go away with new drugs for cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancer, or dementia. And of course, the same patterns exist in other cities, including Toronto, both for life expectancy in general and for sure for COVID, where, as we all know, race and place of residence have been destiny. Just to make clear that this applies here in Canada, even though we don't have as striking a graphic as the one for the London Tube, there have been several studies, the Code Red project in Hamilton, a similar one in Sudbury, and one in Winnipeg, showing huge neighborhood effects in terms of basic health outcomes like life expectancy. The 18-year difference in life expectancy between two Winnipeg neighborhoods equals the difference between average Canadian life expectancy now and that last seen in 1940. The residents living in that poorest neighborhood in Winnipeg are predominantly First Nations, the group which probably bears the starkest impact in terms of place of residence and health. I've illustrated that point with the example of boil water advisories, but the same applies to increased risk of suicide, which is about threefold higher for First Nations people in general, but much higher on reservations. This is a graphic created by the Canadian Medical Association, and while one may quibble with the specific percentages assigned to each category, I think it's hard to argue against the qualitative picture that most biomedical research does not match the major causes of poor health, such as income, housing, conditions in schools and workplaces, nutrition, race, having a disability, neighborhood violence, and other social determinants of health. But these are socioeconomic problems, not healthcare problems. Maybe, but healthcare keeps getting all the money instead of social sectors and services. If we keep taking all the money and not doing anything about the social determinants of health, we will for sure not achieve any useful improvements. Healthcare as currently organized does not improve basic health outcomes for much of the population, and this will worsen as economic deprivation becomes more widespread and as impacts of the climate crisis become more frequent and more devastating. But these are not really research problems. It's not, actually, I would say they still are. It's not at all clear what the most effective or efficient strategies are for improving any of the social determinants of health. All that's clear is that they have larger impacts on health than most of the targets of our current research programs. Some of you may have heard about the recently announced $40 million partnership with Novo Nordisk, a network for healthy populations in Mississauga focused on preventing obesity and diabetes, attesting to the need to look not just at genetic risks for these conditions, but also socioeconomic factors and neighborhood characteristics that promote walking and cycling. We know we need to promote those things, but it's not yet clear what the best way of doing so is. This more balanced approach, one that includes not just the usual precision medicine type quest for magic bullets, needs to be brought to bear on most disease-based research. There are currently 121 agents in clinical trials for the treatment of Alzheimer's, 29 in phase 3 trials. If we keep pursuing this course, the likely future outcome, the best outcome, would probably be a medication as good for dementia as statins are for cardiovascular disease, which is to say a dementia medication that 30 to 100 patients need to take for one person to derive worthwhile benefit, or for most patients to derive a tiny benefit. Currently, the scales are tipped almost entirely towards that left-hand side. Why would we continue to invest primarily in this chase for a magic bullet and not at least even the scales out and invest comparably in research about the optimal ways of organizing care for community-dwelling elderly patients, optimal staffing levels and payment schemes for nursing homes, and other such basic structural problems we know cause more morbidity and mortality than any pill for dementia could ever remedy. The devastation of nursing homes by COVID highlights the importance of investing in such research on better policy and models of care, not just quests for magic bullets. Here's a climate-related example to highlight some of the concrete choices we could make. The study in the first bullet came out in the New England Journal in October of 2019. Across 652 cities, small changes in the concentration of ambient particulate matter were associated with detectable changes in all-cause mortality within 48 hours. Studies from last year showed that climate crisis-related wildfires in BC, California, and Australia produced detectable changes in hospitalization and even deaths in the case of Australia within hours of worsening air quality. And it's not just a few studies here and there. The WHO and the UN have identified air pollution as responsible for 7 million deaths a year and accounting for substantial proportions of deaths due to lung cancer and heart disease, as well as stroke. In this context, do we continue to invest mostly in developing more and more inhalers and then conducting trials with endless permutations of llamas and labas? Or do we balance our research portfolio to include collaboration with those in other sectors to develop ways to reduce pollution, improve air quality, and develop strategies for making sure the healthcare system can handle what will become increasingly frequent surges in patient volumes due to respiratory and cardiovascular illnesses exacerbated by worsening air quality and compounded by higher temperatures? Now is not the time to be discussing depressing big picture problems. Some of us are just trying to get through the day. I get it. I realize that we are burned out and just want to get through this crisis, but we can't keep jumping from one crisis to the next, always putting out fires without ever addressing the causes of those fires in the first place. In fact, I think our current approach actually worsens wellness. I don't mind working hard, neither do most people in medicine. I just like to know my hard work serves a worthwhile purpose. I'm tired of taking care of patients whose health problems primarily reflect factors neither I nor the healthcare system as currently configured can realistically address. I'm also tired of seeing the same quality problems in healthcare delivery persist because we refuse to do the hard work of making real system changes. And the same applies to research. So much work just to get a grant, to do the research, then to carry out the actual work, and then to attempt to get it published, and yet so little real impact to show for it all. It's hard to avoid that feeling of weightlessness under the strange gravity of the Anthropocene era, or worse, worry that after all of the hardship and suffering we've witnessed this past year, we're just going to go back to the way things were before. They were not great to begin with. The way things were before is how we ended up with these massive crises. Why haven't we done any of this? Well, clinical training focuses on short-term goals, fixing and curing, and academics also rewards short-term signs of impact. It's also easy to view as someone else's job to tackle these bigger problems. And of course, there are massive commercial interests in the current approach. As well, the dominant political ideology emphasizes individual actions and accountability over social forces. Some of you may be familiar with the books Switch and Made to Stick by the brothers Chip and Dan Heath, management professors at Stanford and Duke, respectively. Dan Heath's latest book, Upstream, just came out and focuses on the problem of making reactive changes as we do in healthcare rather than preventing problems before they arise. The book is not primarily about healthcare. It covers a number of global problems, but since he wrote the book during COVID, healthcare naturally makes a number of appearances. As he writes, the US healthcare system is designed almost exclusively for reaction. It functions like a giant undo button, but it's hard to find someone in the system whose job it is to address the question, how do we make you healthier? Heath identifies three main reasons we do not tackle upstream problem solving. First, we often don't even see the problem. We see the negative outcomes as natural or inevitable. Historically, many patient safety and quality problems were also generally regarded this way. Patients came into the hospital and maybe they got infections or maybe they received the wrong medication. It's just how it goes, life in the big city. We clearly seem to think similarly about many shortfalls in population health. Lack of ownership refers to the fact that upstream problem solving is usually optional. Downstream work is not optional. It is not optional, for instance, to take care of patients facing complications of obesity, such as diabetes, heart disease, and sleep apnea. It's clear whose job it is to do these things, but it's not at all clear whose job it is to reduce the prevalence of obesity in the first place. It is, in effect, optional for anyone to tackle this problem. What might we do about this? It would be foolish for me or for anyone to think they have the answer. These are massive problems rooted in fundamental aspects of how society is structured. The healthcare system is organized and financed, and the same for biomedical research enterprise, politics, and so on. But we for sure won't come up with any solutions if we don't even acknowledge that we have major problems, problems which threaten to undermine most of our work. And a second step is to acknowledge that, as Einstein once said, we will not solve these problems using the same ways of thinking that gave rise to them. Probably we need to do more policy and advocacy work. I also think we need to rethink our research priorities, since they determine how we invest most of our effort and resources, and they also signal what we care most about. It doesn't mean anything to say that we care about the lives of impoverished or racialized patients and the challenges they face if the lion's share of our resources and intellectual efforts are directed at activities with almost no chance of meaningfully improving their health. Finally, we might want to tackle some complex issues of equity in our own backyard. It's one thing to say we can't change how society values different activities, but we can't really say that for these issues. We are living through a crisis that primarily involves a subspecialty, infectious diseases, and a specialty, namely public health, that have never been well rewarded and are never part of any hospital or research institute's strategic plans. Do we go back to saying that some subspecialties are worth more than others, or do we say that all these subspecialties contribute in important ways to patient care? The same applies to job descriptions. If there were ever a time to think of the justification for how we compensate people in different job descriptions, it's surely now. We know that there are major equity issues affecting people in society in general. There are also ones affecting our own colleagues and other healthcare workers. Surely we could try doing some of the hard work of tackling these issues in our own backyard. I figured I had to include at least one upbeat quotation. Some of you may have heard this one attributed to Bill Gates. It's actually a line that was already anonymously quoted in the mid-60s, but Gates deserves credit for popularizing it because whoever said it was onto something. People do tend to overestimate what they can accomplish in 1 year, but then underestimate what they can achieve in 5 to 10. The hope that quote brings was brought home to me a few months ago when I read this fantastic book, The Ministry for the Future. The author, Kim Stanley Robinson, won basically every important science fiction award for his Mars trilogy. Yet this is not that sort of science fiction. It takes place now and over the next 30 years. It opens with horrific depictions of how bad things will be, including a heat wave in India killing 20 million people, as well as various other catastrophes around the world. But then plausibly and inspiringly depicts the ways that different people and groups around the world make the necessary changes to various aspects of society. The action spans the globe with popular uprisings, eco-terrorism and asymmetrical warfare, student debt strikes and geoengineering. Green New Deal style programs in a number of the world's biggest economies feature prominently, with a post-BJP India leading the way. One terrific aspect of the book is the way it intelligently deals with the problems of massive financial inequality and the ideologies of racism and cultural displacement, which have contributed to so many of the crises we face, not just the climate crisis. And on that note, that so many of the massive crises we face ultimately have to do with questions of equity and othering, I thought I'd end with this passage from a recent essay in the Financial Times by the novelist and activist Arundhati Roy, which I thank Shail Rawal at UHN for bringing to my attention. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us, or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. And with that, I'll say thank you, and I'm happy for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Wow.
Thanks, Kaveh. We have a question or a comment from Larry Robinson. Absolutely amazing talk. You covered this in part, but I'm wondering what is our best next step in progress for the social determinants of health? In addition to cycling to work, should we use our status as trusted leaders to write more about social determinants and educate the public? Can we influence public policy in a specific way? Should there be a U of T DOM think tank focused on the social determinants of health?
First of all, thank you, Larry, for your comments. Look, I thought a lot about specific things we could try, but I really do think that there's just no way that one person is going to think of the best next steps. These are things we're not used to thinking about either, myself included. So I just think that I wanted to start the conversation, and I thank Jillian again for letting me use these citywide grand rounds to do so. This is obviously a little bit tangential to the usual QI portfolio, but I think we need to consider like some concrete options. I mentioned policy and advocacy work for sure is one thing, but I also think just taking suggestions from the department members and figuring what people are interested. I also know that, actually in so many ways, I think we all know this, that there's always a balance between what you do individually and what you work for systematically. Like same with our own wellness. Like obviously we can do a little bit of yoga and mindfulness, but we know in the end we need to make real system changes. And I think that similarly, like I've been hanging out with Stephen Wong and he's let me join his weekly meetings of his group working on homelessness and the homeless hotels that the city is working in. That's brought me some personal satisfaction. I mean, Ed Etchells actually suggested to me a week or two ago that maybe that's something we might all think about doing, like some cause that we feel brings us happiness or pleasure to be part of. But I don't really know what the concrete ways are. I just know that we need to start having these sorts of discussions. Thanks so much, Larry, though.
We have a question from Alan Detsky, and then we'll go to Stephen Narod.
Thanks, Christian. So, wow, I was ready for some talk about quality improvement on bloodstream infections, and this.
And yet you still came.
So I was looking forward to this. So, the fact that it sounded like you had either rehearsed this or you were reading a text, but you were speaking so forcefully, almost emotionally and quickly. So it's obvious to me that you've given this a tremendous amount of thought, and that you are looking, you're sort of putting this out there in a friendly audience, because we are a friendly audience, most of us. And you wanted to get some feedback. So as it was going on, I was trying to figure out, where are they going with this? Like, it's getting more and more depressing. And I felt like that lady on the trampoline bouncing into the next building. So if I could pick at the one thing, I'm trying to figure out, of all the messages you were giving, and there was an overwhelming one, but there were some sub messages. I'm trying to think of the answer as to why does the world look this way, which is something that I have given some thought to. And what is it that causes people to behave in a way that is collectively against their own interests, which is things like saving the planet and dealing with big interventions rather than small interventions. And to my mind, there's two things, and they're interconnected. The first one is, and I do not want to sound like a Marxist/communist, when you have capitalism that is based on profit motive, and you set up a set of incentives for industry to reward investors with real or perceived profits, you get what you've asked for, which is short-termism and solutions to multiple myeloma or transplant, or a new LAMA or LABA, where you can make money, as opposed to reducing particles in the air. So it's no mystery why we are this way. It's because we've set up a system of rewards that gets you exactly what you want. And the second issue is short-termism, or what an economist would call discounting. So people can discount pain in the present, and they a lot, but pain in the future doesn't matter to them. So I'm 69 years old, and 20 years from now, when the world blows up, maybe I'll be here, maybe I won't, as opposed to my grandchildren, who, and I've written a paper on this that I never got published. My youngest grandchild is 2 years old, and in my family, people do live to 100. So she'll be alive maybe 90 years from now. So she would have a different perspective. So the concept of discounting and the concept of profit motive are the two things that make Alberta go crazy when Justin Trudeau wants to establish climate change is an important message.
Sorry, Alan, if I could I think where you're going with all this is that it's not a surprise when we're embedded in a capitalist society with these sorts of incentives.
Right.
Okay, I get that. But first of all, like, are you just saying, let's just go about our business, ignoring that? No. So the point of this talk then is to say, look, of course, I understand that there are massive forces aligned against us. First of all, though, most people don't even talk about this, right? So you're making it sound like it's so obvious what the explanation is, but most people are steeped in an ideology that makes them not even notice how unmoored from reality our whole enterprise is. And as you may know, I mean, the same does happen in economics, where Nobel laureates have written about the fact that the GDP is a terrible measure for what is really important in the economy, and yet we keep using it. It keeps driving all of our policy decisions, right? So I guess I'm saying, well, I don't know how these massive things will be changed, but the first thing we could do in our own house is at least say that our own research enterprise will be aimed at things that are more moored in reality and not so unconnected to basically what is going to improve lives of most people. Sorry to cut. I mean, these are obviously deep problems. I want to make sure that other people have time to comment too. So.
I was trying to get to the question, which was, so what do you do about that? So thanks for the answer.
Thank you, Alan. Sorry, who, Christian?
Dr. Narod.
Okay.
Yeah, a great talk. My question, less wide ranging, more narrow. In the beginning of it, you talked about the input, the evidence from clinical trials, largely randomized clinical trials, as being largely negative and not that much impact. But I mean, one thing I've been struggling with for 10 years without a really good resolution is the capacity to use real world data, a popular term, real world data, to evaluate interventions, both for because there's a ton of it out there.
Right.
They don't sound as expensive, and we have some of the infrastructures here in Ontario, which should allow us. And I've been like struggling my head off to try and figure out to get signals on common chemotherapy drugs for cancer, interventions for cancer, to see numbers that resemble those generated by the randomized trial.
Right.
And I'm wondering if I'm doing it wrong. I'm too optimistic that's approach could even work, whether we collect the data in the right way. And should we be investing in allowing to evaluate real world data to, like what they talk about with COVID vaccine, what we
Sure.
showed them, highly effective.
Well, Steve, there's a lot of issues that related to this question. I mean, for sure, effectiveness work and effectiveness evidence as opposed to efficacy has been something that people have been talking about for a long time. I guess the main point I was trying to make that we all know that there have been many examples of randomized controlled trials that overturned results in previous observational studies. The thing is, the common results that were being overturned, the common reasons they were overturning them was that they were often confounded by socioeconomic factors, the healthy adherer effect, education, and so on. And the lesson we all have taken from that is the importance of randomized controlled trials. The real lesson we should have taken is that socioeconomic factors and education and so on are actually much more powerful than the other things that we're trying to work on. I still do think that effectiveness data and real world data of the type that you're talking about is hugely important. I mean, actually some younger colleagues here in the Department of Medicine have created the Gemini database, which is sort of a data warehouse for all of the inpatient medical patients. And I think it's being rolled out to basically everything. And obviously the family medicine department has some similar things for outpatients. So I think this is hugely important work for sure. And I also know that Andrea Furlan has had her hand up for a little while. So I'm not sure, Christian, if there's no one else ahead of her, I think we should take her question. Thanks, Stephen, for yours.
Sure, we'll go to Dr. Furlan, and then we have a couple of text questions, and then I think Andrew Morris.
Thank you so much. That was an amazing talk. For those of you who know me, I'm trying to tackle the opioid crisis. I wrote the guideline, the Canadian opioid guideline that was published in 2010. It didn't change behaviors a lot of physicians. They continue prescribing a lot of opioids. So I think one of the things that I'm trying is to understand why they're not changing their behaviors is because their patients are reluctant to change their behaviors. They're not exercising, they're not eating well, they're not sleeping well. And so the physicians can't change that, but they can prescribe their opioids. So I'm now tackling directly the patients. So I open a YouTube channel, and it's amazing how can I reach a lot of people via YouTube. So with just one video of exercise, I got 1.3 million views, and people who are emailing me to be my patients. They want to see me, they want to learn how to do it. So I think we need to stop, trying to change what we cannot change and go directly to the patients who want to do better. And now they are teaching their doctors. They're going to their doctors and say, stop my opioids because I'm exercising better. So I think I call this reverse medicine. I'm reaching the doctors and changing the patient's behaviors. So,
no, Andrea, I think
was my comment.
Yeah, no, I'm a little familiar with your work. I think we were actually on a call once in the early days of the opioid crisis, and I admire the work you're doing. The only caution I would say, though, because the same thing comes up in quality improvement and patient safety, the issues I'm talking about are not as unrelated as they might seem to my background in quality improvement, which is like in patient safety, we'll talk about how nurses need to use an IV pump or how doctors need to prescribe. And there's a certain amount of benefit you can get from focusing on the individual, but the system often is what's going to be the bigger target, right? So that, for instance, some patients may be able to exercise, but there's others who basically are trying to keep down 2 low-paying jobs. They don't live in a neighborhood that has much walkability and so on. And so it's very hard for us to sort of prescribe things that they really can't do very easily.
And so, that's why my videos have translator. I translated, put subtitles in 38 languages.
Yeah. That's
so
a great start for sure.
Yeah, because they say to me, I want to see what you're doing, how you're explaining the exercise. So they have 38 subtitles in different languages.
Wow, thank you. Thanks for your comments. And was it Andrew Morris is next, I think?
Sure, we have some text questions as well, but let's go to Dr. Morris.
I was actually just raising my hand for Sue Potanen, who doesn't know how to raise her hand on the Zoom. So
Oh, I apologize. I realized I had my camera on too, watching me eat. I did not mean to do that. So I apologize for anyone who watched me eat. But yeah, I don't have a hand to raise. I don't know why. I've got an old version. So I apologize for that. Just wanted to say, Kaveh, that just an amazing talk, unbelievably amazing talk, in my opinion. Eye-opening and it really just ironic. We just had our foundations meeting yesterday on our undergraduate curriculum. And 2 incredible students came and presented, one from first year, one from second, and they represented a large number of other students. And they came up with exactly what you're saying, which is, we're learning in our first and second years all about medicine and the problems that we're trying to fix. And yet the focus on social determinants and the upfront problems are being skirted and are dismissed altogether. And they were coming from an equity, diversity, inclusivity perspective, but they really were being inclusive of just understanding that there's so much more than fixing problems in terms of the prevention. And it was a powerful talk that they gave, and they put a huge amount of effort into what they provided, and it is going to change the curriculum. And despite the curriculum being relatively new and an incredible curriculum, they've hit the nail where there is this miss. And I really reflected on that, and I think that part of it is the miss in our continuing education to be kept up to speed with this being an ongoing issue that we all have to deal with in all of our disciplines, and recognizing where there even is the problem in our own disciplines. We're so focused on the treatment and the dealing with the problems as opposed to continuously reflecting on, well, how could we have prevented these in the first place?
Right. No, thank you so much for your comments, Susan. I mean, I think Don Berwick, who's probably the most famous person in quality improvement in my field, has recently given some talks and written papers where he sort of says, yeah, the fundamental question we have to ask in medicine is if we just want to be a repair shop, especially when, things are breaking down more and more often, and it's going to become even worse with the economic devastation that the COVID is bringing to most people's lives. And then, of course, the climate crisis. By the way, I just want to say, if it seems weird that I'm talking about the climate crisis, it's not just because of air quality issues and so on, and of course how it's affecting other parts of the world. When a few years ago, before all the supply chain disruptions of COVID, when I was editor at BMJ Quality and Safety in 2017, we got a couple of papers from these hospitals in the US I'd never heard of, they weren't famous ones, on all the QI projects they'd done to make up for the lack of sterile saline. When Hurricane Maria had devastated Puerto Rico and wiped out the manufacturer of most of the sterile saline products in the United States. And so I was like, wow, that really opened my eyes that this sort of supply chain disruption, which we've all just discovered because of COVID, is going to become more and more frequent, as well as, all the other ways in which that's going to happen. But thank you, Susan. I mean, I still remember being in medical school, and then afterwards, like there is sort of, even myself with some of the ideas I have now, like there is a part of me that feels if you've never seen this information before, it's not good. You need to have at least seen it once, even if you've forgotten it. Though I still also remember that in my own medical school, we didn't have time for one body part, and they took a vote and we voted for the foot. So we never covered the foot. And actually our class t-shirt said class of 94, had a picture of a foot, and it just said, don't ask. And still to this day, I try to treat everything involving the foot as by analogy with the hand. But anyway, I am glad to hear that medical students are also, definitely younger people are talking this. Every time I see the CEO of our hospital in the hallway, he talks about this one committee on the environment that I'm on, and he keeps mentioning his children and why they're saying, Dad, why aren't you doing something about the environment? It's definitely a generational effect.
Well, and just to add one more comment, and then I'll be quiet, is just, looking at what we're dealing with right now with obviously COVID, and just what we've dealt with the emergence of infections over the last number of years. Again, looking back at what's the ultimate root causes of all of this? And if you look at population growth of the world and taking over land and having that close proximity with animals, and it's going to continue this way. And so again, looking back at the bigger picture, how can we try to address that than just trying to, again, just band-aid these ongoing, crises that we're dealing with. So.
Thank you so much for all your comments, Susan. I think Laura might be next, but I'm not sure.
If I could just go to some of the text questions. Rodrigo at 1235 asked, are precision medicine and medical research mostly about selling stuff, diagnostic tests, and tailored therapies? How do we move from that to the type of work you advocate for?
A lot of these questions obviously are like whole talks to themselves. I guess I would just I would say that obviously commercial interests have a huge influence. Many of you of a certain age, like basically my age and a little bit older, may remember in the 90s when we tried to transition away from like the resident drug lunch and all that type of stuff. And there was more and more papers coming out showing effectively a dose response relationship between exposure to drug company representatives, even gifts as small as pens and lunches, and never mind like fishing trips on boats, which I knew some people when I was in Boston went on. So we know that these influences make a difference. And in this case, it's partly the commercial interest that Rodrigo is referring to, but it's also an ideologic message that is whispered and sometimes shouted in our ear through every quarter. I mean, a couple of you who I've talked about this before know that I'm struck that some of you may remember in the early 1980s, Margaret Thatcher famously said, as we all know, there was no such thing as society. It was around that time that Ronald Reagan also famously said, you know, the scariest words are like, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. So the two leaders of the free world are basically think it's normal to say this, that there's no such thing as society and the government is a bad thing. Like, we are getting that message all the time, along with the message focused on individual accountability. So it also seems to make sense that individual biology is what we should be working and not on these massive social forces that have huge effects on us. So I think, Rodrigo, I don't have a particular like specific answer, but I do think it can't hurt to say that the maybe largest, best, whatever, most research intensive medical school in the country is going to start thinking about shifting our targets and maybe working with some of the organizations we can influence, like CHR and others, to say that, you know, we're going to put our money where our mouth is and say that our current approach is not adequate and it needs to be more balanced. Who's next, Chris?
Let's do one more quick one from the texts. Joe Kim asks, how do we change existing incentive structures to encourage academicians to start working on the most pressing issues?
Yeah, sure.
facing
It's a
us?
great question, Joe. And actually, I did have some bits on this that I took out. Like when I mentioned the thing about fee-for-service reimbursement and working some other things in our own backyard, I left out the fact that there's actually a massive evidence base showing that people are more creative and perform better if they're basically paid at a comfortable amount, and that actually payment by incentives actually stifles creativity. And there's numerous examples of leading to unethical and perverse, basically fraudulent activity. And we also know that, of course, the fee-for-service system like drives so many of the quality problems that we spend like our choosing wisely mindset trying to solve off the side of our desk while we don't address the obvious cause of so much of it. So I know that one of the reasons we've ended up in this situation is no one wants to tackle that. Let's kick it down the road. But like Alan's point at the beginning was there are massive societal structures about the whole nature of capitalism and so on. Well, okay, that may be too tough for us to tackle, but why don't we practice by taking 3 to 5 years and actually working on some of these equity and incentive issues in our own backyard? I just think there's no excuse for not tackling them now when they are so clearly related to some of these massive crises. And before we run out of time, I just feel bad with Laura's hand still hanging there for so long. So please, Laura, a fellow Winnipegger.
So this was, just to reiterate, an excellent talk. Really eye-opening and incredible delivery. You know, the main thing you touched on is this is an Anthropocene problem. So the root cause of everything, whether you're talking about racism, the racism or the poverty or displacement caused by climate change, these are all human problems caused by people. So in the comments, I try to put this very, very succinctly, which is, what can we do as physicians to help people not be people? You know, we are driven, you know, we are solipsistic, we're individualistic, we like short-term gain, we are tribal. These things are baked into our brains. They're hard to change. Artificial attempts to change those have generally ended in failure, sometimes abject failure. Is there a medical solution down the road?
Well, obviously, again, I'm not going to pretend, yes, I have the answer to all of our civilization's problems. I guess I would say, no, for sure, Laura. But you know what you say? I mean, people say we're selfish, we're solipsistic, but actually there is a very real sense in which we're not. We know that we often get genuine pleasure from helping other people. We're in a profession that's supposed to put the interests of other people above any material gain. So of course, I mean, we know what it's like to love our family, do things for them. And sometimes the things that make us feel best is when we can really feel we've helped the patient. We can't do it all the time if it means going an extra mile every time. So I do think that one of the things, like I said, there's all this literature on incentives and so on. Of course, I know that also people don't like to have no recognition for what they've done working extra hard and so on. So obviously the hard work that we need to do is figure out how to balance these sort of competing or sometimes twin sort of awarenesses that we have, that on the one hand, people like to be rewarded for what they're doing in the short term, but on the other hand, we know that the deepest satisfaction and pleasure we find often comes from doing something quite differently. So I think that's all I will say for now, and I don't know if
we continue to inspire.
Well, thank you very much, Laura. I just
wanted to add that Dr. Jillian Hawker says that we will invite people to come together to continue this discussion. Cooper asks, well, first she says, excellent talk, Kaveh. I'm all for advocacy and community work by department faculty members being seen as part of our jobs instead of something we do in our spare time outside of our jobs. How do we change the criteria for success to value this sort of work? Do we need a clinician advocate job description in the way CQI was created, or do we need to value the sort of work in other ways?
I think that, thank you, first of all, Ayelet, for that comment. And actually, someone made a similar comment when I gave a similar talk to ICS rounds. I think there for sure we need to do more advocacy, and we probably need to figure out a way to acknowledge when it's been done. I do think one of the great things about the creative professional activity thing is it is quite loose. And there are examples of people like, who've advocated for, wearing helmets in hockey games, wearing seatbelts, these sorts of things. Like when it's clear that a substantial amount of somebody's time has been dedicated to advocating for something that's related to something that you can point to in their other activities. I think we already have that. I do think we could be better trained for it. I think in the same way that, I think one of the recent Department of Medicine newsletters was on sort of talking to people about who've been using social media. And we know that many of our colleagues have been doing a great job, sometimes, at the risk of some vitriol that's been pointed at them. And many of them, like we do clinically a lot of times once we go to practice, they sort of learned on the job and learned on the fly. And obviously and there have been people who've done that with advocacy over their career too, but we probably could do a better job of, getting members of our department who are already good at this, or, connections to people from other sectors to do this. So I think that this is definitely something we could do more systematically and train ourselves better to do. I think probably we're out of time now. So I just want to say thank you again for everybody for your attention. And I'll look forward to interacting with many of you in the weeks and months to come as we try to brainstorm ways to move this forward. I don't know, Jillian, it looks like you might want to say something. You unmuted yourself.
I just want to say that this is probably the record attendance we've had at Citywide Rounds. We've had pretty darn good Citywide Rounds. But I've been saying to Kaveh, he has an important voice. And I think we've just demonstrated how much people want to hear that voice. And I really hope that this can launch a broader conversation in the department, but broadly across the university about shifting our approaches and looking more closely at how we can shift the social health determinants. So thank you, Kaveh, for doing a beautiful job.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of the day. Take care.
Thank you.